Marcus Sullivan had been living alone on his cattle ranch for exactly 10 years, 3 months and 12 days. He knew this because he marked each passing day on the old calendar hanging in his kitchen, the same way prisoners mark time on cell walls. The difference was that Marcus had chosen his isolation. The ranch sprawled across 2,000 acres of Montana wilderness, surrounded by rolling hills and dense forests that seemed to stretch endlessly toward the horizon. His nearest neighbor lived 43 miles away, and the small town of Cedar Falls was a grueling 2-hour drive on winding dirt roads that became impassable during heavy rains or winter storms. This remoteness was exactly what Marcus had wanted when he bought the property with his life savings after leaving the army. Every morning began the same way. Marcus would wake before dawn, brew strong black coffee in the same chipped mug he had used for a decade, and step onto his front porch to survey his domain. The porch wrapped around the front and side of his modest log cabin, offering views of the pastures where his 100 head of cattle grazed peacefully. He would stand there in the crisp morning air, steam rising from his coffee cup, listening to the sounds of nature awakening around him. The routine never varied. After coffee, he would check on the cattle, repair fences, maintain equipment, and handle the endless tasks that came with managing a ranch single-handedly. He had become remarkably self-sufficient over the years, learning to fix everything from broken water pumps to diesel engines. When supplies ran low, he would make his monthly trip to town, loading his old pickup truck with enough food and necessities to last another month. The people in Cedar Falls had long since stopped trying to engage him in conversation beyond the basic pleasantries required for business transactions. They called him the hermit rancher, though never to his face. Some whispered that he was running from something, others that he had simply lost his mind after coming back from overseas. Marcus heard the whispers but didn't care. He had found peace in his solitude, or at least he had convinced himself that he had. His only companions were his 2 dogs, Rex and Belle, both German shepherds he had rescued as puppies from the animal shelter in town 7 years ago. They were fiercely loyal, and seemed to understand that their job was to help Marcus maintain his chosen isolation. They would bark at any approaching vehicle long before it came into view, giving Marcus time to decide whether he wanted to deal with visitors or simply wait them out. The cabin itself reflected Marcus's practical nature. It was sturdy and functional but lacked any feminine touches or decorative elements. The furniture was basic, the walls bare except for a few photographs of his cattle and the Montana landscape. His bedroom contained only a bed, a dresser, and a small nightstand. The living room had a couch, a coffee table, and a television that received only 3 channels on good days. Books were his primary entertainment, and shelves lined one wall, filled with everything from technical manuals to classic literature. Marcus had built this life deliberately, brick by brick, fence post by fence post. After 2 tours of duty in Afghanistan, he had returned home to find that the world had become too loud, too chaotic, too full of people who didn't understand what he had seen and done. The noise of traffic, the constant chatter of conversation, even the simple act of standing in line at a grocery store had become unbearable. He needed space, silence, and the kind of honest work that came with raising cattle on land that stretched as far as the eye could see. The ranch provided everything he needed to justify his isolation. Cattle required daily attention, fences needed constant maintenance, and equipment demanded regular servicing. These tasks filled his days and gave him purpose without requiring him to interact with another human being for weeks at a time. When loneliness crept in during the long winter evenings, he would remind himself that this was better than the alternative. Better than panic attacks in crowded places, better than sleepless nights in the city, better than trying to explain to people why he couldn't simply get over whatever it was that haunted him. His financial situation was stable but modest. The cattle provided enough income to cover his basic expenses, and his military disability payments helped during lean months. He had no debt, no credit cards, and no desire for anything beyond the essentials needed to maintain his simple existence. The truck was 12 years old but reliable, his equipment was well maintained if not new, and his wants had shrunk to match his means. As the years passed, Marcus had developed an acute awareness of his environment that bordered on the supernatural. He could predict weather changes by the behavior of his cattle, identify approaching vehicles by the sound of their engines long before they came into view, and sense when something was amiss on his property with an accuracy that amazed even him. This heightened awareness was both a gift and a curse, a reminder of skills he had learned in places he tried not to remember. The anniversary of his 10th year of solitude had passed without ceremony or acknowledgement. Marcus had simply made another mark on his calendar and continued with his routine. He had achieved what he set out to accomplish, a life of complete self-sufficiency, free from the complications and pain that came with human relationships. He told himself he was content, that this was enough, that he needed nothing and no one else. But contentment and happiness are not the same thing, and late at night, when the wind howled across the empty plains and the cabin creaked with settling timber, Marcus sometimes wondered if he had chosen peace or simply a different kind of prison. These thoughts came and went like the seasons, unwelcome but inevitable, and he had learned to endure them the same way he endured the harsh Montana winters. On this particular September evening, as storm clouds gathered on the western horizon, and the first drops of rain began to fall, Marcus had no way of knowing that his decade of solitude was about to come to an end in the most unexpected way possible. The storm hit with the kind of fury that only Montana could deliver. Rain pounded against the cabin windows like bullets, and lightning split the darkness every few seconds, followed immediately by thunder that shook the building to its foundation. Marcus sat in his living room, reading by the light of an oil lamp since the power had gone out an hour ago, when Rex and Belle began barking with an urgency he had never heard before. At first, Marcus ignored them. The dogs often got agitated during severe storms, but as the barking continued and grew more frantic, he realized this was different. They weren't cowering from the thunder or whimpering at the lightning. They were alerting him to something else, entirely. Setting down his book, Marcus grabbed a flashlight and rain slicker from the closet near the front door. The moment he opened the door, the wind nearly knocked him backward. Rain lashed at his face with stinging intensity, and he had to squint to see anything through the darkness. Rex and Belle had positioned themselves at the edge of the porch, their barks now mixed with anxious whines as they stared toward the long driveway that led to the main road. Marcus swept his flashlight beam across the yard, expecting to see a fallen tree branch or maybe a piece of equipment that had blown loose. Instead, the light caught something that made him question his eyesight. There, stumbling up his driveway in the pouring rain, was a figure in white. As lightning illuminated the scene, Marcus could see clearly that it was a woman wearing what appeared to be a wedding dress, soaked through and clinging to her body as she struggled against the wind. She moved like someone in a daze, stumbling every few steps but continuing forward with determined desperation. Her long dark hair was plastered to her head and shoulders, and even from a distance Marcus could see that she was shivering violently. The wedding dress, which must have once been beautiful, was now muddy and torn at the hem, trailing behind her like a banner of surrender. For a moment, Marcus stood frozen on his porch, unsure if what he was seeing was real or some kind of hallucination, brought on by too many years of solitude. Women in wedding dresses didn't simply appear in the middle of Montana storms, especially not on his property 40 miles from nowhere. But as another flash of lightning revealed the desperation in her movements, Marcus's military training kicked in, overriding his confusion. He rushed down the porch steps and into the storm, his boots splashing through puddles that had already formed in the yard. The woman looked up at his approaching light, and Marcus saw her face for the first time. She appeared to be in her late 20s with features that spoke of both beauty and current distress. Her eyes were wide with fear or exhaustion, and her lips were blue from cold. She tried to say something, but her words were lost in the wind. When Marcus reached her, she collapsed against him, her legs finally giving out after what must have been an incredible ordeal. She was lighter than he expected, her body racked with violent shivers that he could feel through the soaked fabric of her dress. Without hesitation, Marcus scooped her up in his arms, surprised by how naturally the protective instinct emerged after years of dormancy. The journey back to the cabin took only seconds, but Marcus was acutely aware of the woman's condition with every step. She seemed semi-conscious, her head lolling against his chest as he navigated through the storm. Rex and Belle followed closely, their earlier agitation replaced by protective curiosity about this unexpected visitor. Once inside, Marcus deposited the woman gently on his couch, then immediately went to work addressing her obvious hypothermia. He grabbed every blanket he owned from the bedroom and wrapped them around her shivering form, then stoked the fire in his fireplace until flames danced high against the stone chimney. The warmth filled the room quickly, but the woman continued to shake uncontrollably. Her wedding dress was completely saturated, and Marcus realized she needed to get out of the wet clothing immediately if she was going to recover from her ordeal. This presented a problem he had never anticipated in his decade of solitude. He had no experience dealing with unconscious women in wedding dresses, no protocol for handling such an unusual emergency. Turning away to give her privacy, Marcus called out over his shoulder, asking if she could hear him, if she needed help removing the wet dress. Her only response was incoherent mumbling and continued shivering. Realizing she was in no condition to help herself, Marcus made the practical decision to focus on her survival rather than modesty. He found his largest flannel shirt and a pair of thermal underwear, placing them on the coffee table within reach. The woman's condition seemed to be deteriorating rather than improving despite the warmth of the fire and the layers of blankets. Her shivering had become more violent, and her breathing appeared shallow and rapid. Marcus had seen hypothermia before during his military service, and he knew that time was critical in cases this severe. Kneeling beside the couch, he tried again, to get her attention, speaking loudly and clearly to penetrate whatever fog had settled over her consciousness. This time, her eyes fluttered open, revealing brown irises that struggled to focus on his face. She tried to speak again, and Marcus leaned closer to hear her words over the continuing storm outside. What he heard made no sense at first. She was mumbling about someone named David, about a church, about running. The words came in disconnected fragments that painted no clear picture of how she had ended up on his remote property in the middle of a storm. But the desperation in her voice was unmistakable, even through her semi-conscious state. Marcus had spent 10 years avoiding exactly this kind of situation. He had built his entire life around the principle of not getting involved with other people's problems, not taking responsibility for anyone but himself and his animals. Yet here was a woman who clearly needed help, who might die if he didn't act quickly and decisively. The storm showed no signs of letting up, and even if Marcus wanted to take her to a hospital, the roads would be impassable until morning at the earliest. He was going to have to handle this situation himself, drawing on whatever medical knowledge he had retained from his army training and common sense. As he monitored her breathing and pulse, Marcus realized that his carefully constructed world of isolation had just been shattered by a woman in a wedding dress who had appeared out of nowhere, like something from a fever dream. Marcus spent the entire night alternating between stoking the fire and monitoring the mysterious woman's condition. Her violent shivering gradually subsided as her body temperature returned to normal, but she remained unconscious for hours, occasionally mumbling fragments of words that revealed nothing about her identity or circumstances. By dawn, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world washed clean and sparkling under the morning sun. Rex and Belle had maintained their vigil throughout the night, positioning themselves near the couch as if they understood the seriousness of the situation. Marcus had always marveled at their intuition, but their behavior toward this stranger surprised him. Instead of the wariness they typically showed toward visitors, they seemed protective, almost nurturing in their attention to the woman. As the first rays of sunlight streamed through the cabin windows, the woman finally began to stir. Her eyes opened slowly, blinking against the unfamiliar surroundings as consciousness gradually returned. Marcus, who had been dozing in his armchair beside the fire, immediately snapped to attention when he heard her moving. She sat up carefully, wincing as if every muscle in her body ached, then looked around the cabin with obvious confusion. When her gaze finally settled on Marcus, her eyes widened with a mixture of fear and uncertainty. He could see her trying to piece together how she had ended up in this strange place, wrapped in blankets that weren't hers, wearing clothes that definitely weren't hers. Marcus remained seated, understanding that his size and unfamiliar presence might be intimidating to someone who had clearly experienced trauma. He spoke softly, explaining that he had found her collapsed in his driveway during the storm and brought her inside to warm up. He assured her that she was safe and that he meant her no harm. The woman listened to his explanation in silence, her hands clutching the blanket around her shoulders. When he finished speaking, she tried to respond but discovered that her voice was barely a whisper, raw from exposure to the cold and rain. Marcus brought her a glass of water and waited patiently as she sipped it slowly, each swallow seeming to cause her discomfort. After several minutes, she was able to speak, though her voice remained hoarse and weak. Her first words were an apology for the trouble she had caused, followed immediately by questions about where she was and how far she was from Cedar Falls. Marcus explained his location and the distance to town, watching as the information seemed to overwhelm her. Her name, she finally revealed, was Sarah Mitchell, and she was supposed to have been married yesterday afternoon in Cedar Falls. The wedding dress she had been wearing was evidence of that failed ceremony, though she provided no details about why she had been wandering through a storm instead of celebrating with her new husband. When Marcus gently pressed for more information, Sarah's composure crumbled, and tears began streaming down her face. Through her sobs, fragments of her story emerged. She had discovered something about her fiancé, David, just hours before their wedding ceremony. The revelation had been devastating enough to send her fleeing from the church in her wedding dress, driving blindly into the Montana wilderness without any clear destination in mind. Her car had broken down somewhere on the back roads during the storm, and she had walked for hours before collapsing on Marcus's property. Marcus found himself in unfamiliar territory, trying to comfort a crying woman while maintaining the emotional distance he had cultivated for a decade. He offered practical solutions, suggesting they could look for her car once she was feeling stronger, but Sarah shook her head. She wasn't ready to face whatever she had left behind in Cedar Falls. The thought of returning to town, of explaining to everyone what had happened, seemed to terrify her more than being stranded with a stranger. As the morning progressed, Marcus prepared breakfast while Sarah remained on the couch, staring out the window at the peaceful ranch landscape. He could see her processing her situation, trying to decide what came next. The simple meal of eggs, bacon, and toast seemed to revive her spirits somewhat, and color began returning to her pale cheeks. Sarah proved to be surprisingly easy to talk to once the initial shock wore off. She asked thoughtful questions about the ranch, about Marcus's life in isolation, and about how he managed to survive so far from civilization. Her curiosity seemed genuine rather than polite, as if she was truly interested in understanding his chosen lifestyle. Marcus found himself opening up more than he had in years, describing the daily rhythms of ranch life and the satisfaction he found in self-sufficiency. What struck Marcus most about Sarah was her lack of judgment about his isolated existence. Where others had always seemed to view his solitude as strange or unhealthy, she appeared to understand it as a valid choice. She didn't pry into his reasons for living alone or suggest that he should rejoin society. Instead, she listened with genuine interest as he explained the practical aspects of managing a cattle ranch single-handedly. By afternoon, Sarah was strong enough to walk around the cabin, though Marcus insisted she take it slowly. Her wedding dress had been ruined beyond repair, so she continued wearing his oversized clothes, which somehow made her seem both vulnerable and surprisingly at home in his rustic environment. She helped with simple tasks around the cabin, folding blankets and washing dishes with an efficiency that suggested she was accustomed to taking care of herself. The question of what happened next hung in the air between them, unspoken but obvious. Sarah clearly needed time to process whatever had driven her from her wedding, and Marcus was surprised to find that he wasn't eager to rush her back to town. Her presence had disrupted his routine, but not in the unpleasant way he had always imagined it would. Instead, he found her company oddly comforting, as if she filled a space in his life he hadn't realized was empty. As evening approached, Marcus suggested that Sarah might want to call someone to let them know she was safe. The idea clearly distressed her, and she admitted that she wasn't ready to talk to anyone from her previous life. She asked if she could stay one more night, just until she figured out what to do next. Marcus agreed. though he couldn't help wondering if he was making a mistake that would complicate both their lives. That night, as Sarah slept peacefully on his couch and the dogs maintained their protective watch, Marcus lay awake thinking about how quickly his carefully ordered world had changed. One storm, one desperate woman, and suddenly his decade of solitude felt less like an achievement and more like a preparation for something he hadn't known he was waiting for. 3 days passed before Sarah was ready to share the full story of why she had fled her wedding. Marcus didn't press her for details, understanding that some wounds needed time before they could be examined in the light. Instead, he let her find her rhythm in the daily routine of ranch life, watching as she gradually relaxed and began to smile more frequently. Sarah proved to be remarkably adaptable to ranch life. She woke early without complaint, helped with morning chores, and showed genuine interest in learning about cattle management. Marcus found himself explaining things he had done automatically for years, seeing his work through fresh eyes as he taught her to check water levels, identify sick animals, and repair simple equipment. Her hands, which had been soft and manicured for her wedding day, quickly developed calluses from handling tools and working with fence posts. She complained good-naturedly about the physical demands of ranch work, but never asked to avoid tasks or return to the comfortable passivity of being a guest. Marcus respected her willingness to contribute and found that many jobs became easier with an extra pair of hands. On the third evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, Sarah finally began to talk. She spoke quietly at first, her voice barely audible over the evening sounds of cattle and insects, but gradually gained strength as she unburdened herself of the secret she had been carrying. David Richardson had been her fiancé for 2 years, a successful businessman who owned several stores in Cedar Falls and the surrounding area. Everyone in town considered him a catch, and Sarah's family had been thrilled when he proposed. The wedding had been planned for months, with guest lists, catering, flowers, and all the elaborate details that make small-town celebrations memorable events. But 3 hours before the ceremony, while looking for David's cufflinks in his car, Sarah had discovered a stack of photographs hidden in his glove compartment. The images showed David with another woman, clearly intimate, clearly recent based on his haircut and clothing she recognized. But what devastated Sarah wasn't just the evidence of his infidelity. It was the realization that the other woman was her younger sister Emily. The betrayal cut deeper than anything Sarah could have imagined. Emily had been her maid of honor, had helped plan the wedding, had consoled Sarah through pre-wedding nerves while secretly carrying on an affair with the groom. The discovery shattered not just Sarah's relationship with David, but her trust in the person she had been closest to since childhood. Marcus listened without interruption, understanding that Sarah needed to release the entire story without judgment or commentary. He could see the pain in her expression as she described confronting David in his dressing room at the church, showing him the photographs, watching him fumble for explanations that only made everything worse. David had begged her to go through with the ceremony anyway, claiming the affair with Emily was just a meaningless fling that would end after the wedding. He promised to be faithful, offered to cut all contact with Emily, even suggested they could work through their problems during their honeymoon in Hawaii. The callousness of his suggestions, the assumption that Sarah would overlook such a fundamental betrayal for the sake of appearances, had filled her with rage she didn't know she was capable of feeling. Instead of confronting Emily or creating a scene in front of their wedding guests, Sarah had simply walked out of the church in her wedding dress. She had driven aimlessly through the countryside, tears blurring her vision as she tried to process the destruction of everything she had believed about her future. When her car broke down during the storm, she had continued walking, driven by a need to get as far away from her old life as possible. Marcus found himself angry on Sarah's behalf, feeling protective instincts he thought he had buried years ago. The idea of someone betraying her trust so completely, of using her love against her awakened feelings he had forgotten he was capable of experiencing. He had to resist the urge to drive to Cedar Falls and have a conversation with David Richardson that the man would never forget. Sarah's story explained her reluctance to contact anyone from her previous life. The wedding guests would still be talking about her dramatic exit, speculating about what had happened and why the bride had simply vanished. Her family would be demanding explanations she wasn't ready to give, and David would undoubtedly be spinning his own version of events to minimize his role in the disaster. As the days continued to pass, Sarah seemed to find peace in the simplicity of ranch life. She learned to milk the 2 dairy cows Marcus kept for his own use, gathered eggs from the chicken coop each morning, and even helped deliver a calf when one of the heifers went into labor unexpectedly. Her natural intelligence and quick learning ability impressed Marcus, who had grown accustomed to doing everything himself. More surprisingly, Sarah seemed to thrive in the isolated environment that had driven away every other visitor to Marcus's ranch over the years. She didn't complain about the lack of shopping, restaurants, or entertainment. She didn't seem to miss television, internet, or the constant connectivity that defined modern life. Instead, she appeared to find the same peace in the vast Montana landscape that had drawn Marcus there a decade earlier. Their conversations in the evenings became the highlight of Marcus's days. Sarah was well-read and curious about the world, able to discuss everything from literature to politics to philosophy with an intelligence that challenged his own thinking. She asked about his military service, and Marcus found himself sharing stories he had never told anyone, opening up about experiences that had shaped his need for solitude. Sarah, in turn, talked about her dreams beyond the small-town life she had been planning with David. She had studied journalism in college but had settled into a comfortable job at the local newspaper, writing about church socials and high school sports rather than pursuing the investigative reporting that had originally excited her. The wedding and planned marriage had represented security and social acceptance, but she was beginning to realize it might also have represented a kind of surrender to mediocrity. As Sarah's second week on the ranch began, both she and Marcus were avoiding the obvious question of what came next. Her presence had transformed his daily routine in ways he couldn't have imagined, adding warmth and companionship to a life he had convinced himself was complete in its solitude. But they both knew that eventually, decisions would have to be made about her future. The outside world hadn't forgotten about Sarah Mitchell. Reports of her disappearance had reached the local sheriff's department, and Marcus knew it was only a matter of time before someone came looking for her. The question was whether she would be ready to face that world when it arrived at his door, and whether the peace she had found on his isolated ranch could survive the inevitable confrontation with the life she had left behind. Sheriff Tom Bradley arrived on a Tuesday morning, his patrol car kicking up dust clouds as it navigated the rough road to Marcus's ranch. Rex and Belle announced his approach long before the vehicle came into view, their barking alerting both Marcus and Sarah to the inevitable arrival of the outside world they had been avoiding. Sarah's face went pale when she saw the sheriff's car through the kitchen window. She had known this moment would come, but the reality of facing questions about her disappearance still filled her with dread. Marcus placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, reminding her that she was an adult who had chosen to leave town of her own free will. She had committed no crime, and no one could force her to return against her wishes. Sheriff Bradley was a man in his 50s who had known Marcus since his arrival in the area 10 years earlier. They had developed a relationship based on mutual respect and minimal interaction, exactly the way Marcus preferred it. Bradley understood that the isolated rancher valued his privacy and only visited when absolutely necessary. The sheriff's questions were straightforward and professional. Sarah Mitchell had been reported missing by her family after she failed to return home following her wedding day disappearance. Her car had been found abandoned on a back road with mechanical problems, but there had been no trace of her whereabouts for 2 weeks. Multiple search parties had combed the area without success, and her family was understandably worried about her safety. Sarah answered the sheriff's questions calmly, confirming her identity and explaining that she had walked to Marcus's ranch during the storm and had been staying there voluntarily while she decided what to do next. She emphasized that she had not been harmed or held against her will, and that Marcus had provided shelter and assistance when she needed help. Sheriff Bradley listened carefully to Sarah's account, occasionally glancing at Marcus as if trying to gauge the dynamics between them. His years of experience had taught him to recognize signs of coercion or abuse, but he found none in Sarah's demeanor or in Marcus's protective but respectful behavior toward her. The conversation took an interesting turn turn when the sheriff mentioned David Richardson's version of events. According to David, he and Sarah had experienced a minor argument before the wedding, nothing serious enough to justify her dramatic exit. He claimed to have no idea why she had left and insisted that he was eager to reconcile and proceed with their planned marriage. Sarah's reaction to this information was immediate and intense. Her hands clenched into fists, and Marcus could see the anger flashing in her eyes as she processed David's deliberate misrepresentation of what had happened. The idea that he was portraying their situation as a simple misunderstanding that could be easily resolved infuriated her more than his original betrayal. Without revealing the specific details of her discovery, Sarah made it clear to Sheriff Bradley that she would not be returning to David Richardson under any circumstances. Her relationship with her fiancé was permanently over, and she had no intention of explaining her reasons to anyone who didn't need to know them. The sheriff, sensing the depth of her conviction, didn't press for details. The more complex issue was Sarah's family, particularly her parents, who were genuinely worried about her disappearance and deserved to know that she was safe. Sheriff Bradley suggested that she at least call them to confirm her well-being, even if she wasn't ready to return home immediately. Sarah reluctantly agreed, understanding that her parents' concern was legitimate, even if she wasn't prepared to face their questions. The phone call to her parents was emotionally difficult but necessary. Sarah assured them that she was safe and unharmed but couldn't provide a timeline for when she might return to Cedar Falls. Her mother's relief was obvious even through the poor cell phone connection, but her father's questions about her plans and her relationship with David were harder to deflect. After Sheriff Bradley left, promising to update the missing person report and inform Sarah's family of her safety, both Marcus and Sarah felt the weight of decisions that could no longer be avoided. The outside world now knew where she was, and the protective bubble of isolation that had allowed her to heal and think clearly had been burst. Sarah spent the rest of that day in contemplation, walking alone through the pastures while Marcus gave her space to process the implications of the sheriff's visit. She returned to the cabin at dinner time with a newfound determination in her expression, as if the contact with her previous life had clarified something important for her. That evening, Sarah made a decision that surprised even herself. She wanted to stay on the ranch, at least for the immediate future. The peace she had found in the isolated Montana landscape, the satisfaction she derived from physical work, and the growing connection she felt with Marcus all contributed to her reluctance to return to the life she had left behind. But Sarah was practical enough to recognize that her presence on Marcus's ranch couldn't continue indefinitely without some kind of formal arrangement. She proposed working as a hired hand, earning her keep through labor, and contributing to the ranch's operations in exchange for room and board. She had savings from her job at the newspaper that could help with expenses, and she was willing to learn whatever skills were necessary to be genuinely useful. Marcus found himself torn between his desire for Sarah's continued presence and his concern about the complications her staying might create. His carefully constructed isolation would be permanently altered, and he wasn't certain he was prepared for the emotional vulnerability that came with sharing his life with another person. The practical considerations were equally challenging. The ranch generated enough income to support one person comfortably, but adding a second person would require careful financial planning. The cabin would need modifications to provide Sarah with proper privacy, and the workload would need to be restructured to accommodate two people with different skill levels. More significantly, Marcus realized that his feelings for Sarah had evolved far beyond simple compassion for someone in need of help. Her intelligence, resilience, and adaptability had impressed him, but it was her genuine appreciation for the life he had built that touched him most deeply. She didn't see his isolation as something that needed to be fixed or changed. She saw it as a valid choice that had created something beautiful and sustainable. As they discussed the practical aspects of Sarah's proposal, both of them carefully avoided acknowledging the emotional undercurrents that were influencing their decision-making. Neither was ready to admit that their relationship had developed beyond friendship, but both felt the growing connection that made the idea of separation painful to contemplate. The conversation continued late into the night, covering everything from financial arrangements to long-term goals to the reactions they could expect from the community in Cedar Falls. By morning, they had reached a tentative agreement to try a partnership arrangement, with the understanding that either of them could end the arrangement if it proved unworkable. Sarah's decision to stay represented more than just a practical solution to her current circumstances. It was a choice to build something new rather than return to repair something that had been fundamentally broken. The woman who had collapsed on Marcus's porch in a ruined wedding dress was choosing to create a different kind of future, one based on honest work, genuine partnership, and the kind of peace that could only be found in the vast Montana wilderness. 6 months after Sarah's arrival, the ranch had transformed into something neither Marcus nor Sarah could have imagined. What had begun as a temporary refuge for a woman fleeing her wedding day had evolved into a genuine partnership that brought out the best qualities in both of them. Sarah proved to be more than just an able ranch hand. Her journalism background gave her a different perspective on problem solving, and she approached challenges with a methodical curiosity that complemented Marcus's intuitive understanding of the land and animals. Together, they had implemented improvements to the ranch's efficiency that Marcus had never considered during his decade of solitary management. The most significant change was the addition of a small organic vegetable operation. Sarah had suggested that the rich Montana soil and abundant water supply could support crops that would diversify their income and reduce their dependence on cattle alone. What started as a small experimental garden had grown into 2 acres of vegetables that they sold to restaurants in Cedar Falls and the surrounding area. Sarah's business sense proved invaluable in marketing their products. She designed simple but effective promotional materials, established relationships with local chefs who valued fresh, organic produce, and even created a modest website that attracted customers from larger towns within driving distance. The additional income allowed them to make improvements to the ranch infrastructure and provided financial security that Marcus had never enjoyed as a solo operation. The physical modifications to the cabin had been completed by early spring. Marcus had built an addition that included a private bedroom and bathroom for Sarah, along with a larger kitchen that could accommodate their expanded meal preparation needs. The work had been challenging but satisfying, and Sarah had insisted on helping with every aspect of the construction, learning carpentry skills that amazed Marcus with her quick progress. Their working relationship had settled into a comfortable rhythm that maximized both their strengths. Marcus handled the heavy mechanical work and livestock management, while Sarah took charge of the garden operations, bookkeeping, and customer relations. They made decisions together, debating different approaches until they reached consensus, and Marcus found that having someone to discuss problems with often led to better solutions than he had achieved alone. The emotional aspects of their partnership had developed more slowly and carefully. Both Marcus and Sarah were cautious about risking the successful working relationship they had built by introducing romantic complications. They had each been hurt deeply in different ways, and neither wanted to jeopardize the stability they had found together by moving too quickly. But the attraction between them was undeniable, growing stronger as they shared the daily intimacies of running a ranch together. Simple moments became charged with meaning. Marcus's hand steadying Sarah as she climbed down from the hayloft, Sarah's gentle touch when she cleaned a cut on Marcus's arm, the way they unconsciously moved in coordination during routine tasks, as if they had been working together for years instead of months. The people of Cedar Falls had eventually accepted Sarah's choice to remain on Marcus's ranch, though not without considerable gossip and speculation. Some viewed her decision as scandalous, abandoning her fiancé to live unmarried with a hermit rancher. Others saw it as romantic, a dramatic escape from a confining small-town existence. Sarah discovered that she cared very little about either interpretation, having found a contentment that wasn't dependent on community approval. Her relationship with her family had required more careful navigation. Her parents had initially been hurt and confused by her refusal to return home or explain exactly what had driven her from her wedding. But as months passed, and they could see that Sarah was genuinely happy and thriving in her new life, they gradually accepted her choice. Her mother even admitted during one phone call that Sarah sounded more alive and confident than she had in years. The situation with Emily remained unresolved and painful. Sarah's sister had made several attempts to contact her, leaving messages that ranged from tearful apologies to angry accusations. Sarah had not responded to any of them, not yet ready to confront the betrayal that had shattered their relationship. Some wounds, she was learning, needed more time to heal before they could be examined without reopening. David Richardson had proven to be more persistent and problematic. He had made several uninvited trips to the ranch, each time becoming more aggressive in his demands that Sarah return to Cedar Falls and honor their engagement. Marcus had handled these encounters with restraint but firmness, making it clear that Sarah's decisions were her own, and that David was not welcome on the property. The final confrontation had occurred in late spring, when David arrived with what he claimed were legal documents compelling Sarah to return property that belonged to him. The documents proved to be meaningless bluffs, but David's increasingly erratic behavior concerned both Marcus and Sarah. They had contacted Sheriff Bradley, who warned David that further harassment could result in a restraining order and possible criminal charges. As summer progressed, the ranch flourished under their joint management. The cattle were healthy and multiplying. The vegetable operation exceeded their most optimistic projections, and they had even begun exploring the possibility of adding sheep to diversify their livestock portfolio. More importantly, both Marcus and Sarah had found a sense of purpose and partnership that neither had experienced before. The turning point in their personal relationship came during a particularly difficult calving season. One of Marcus's best cows had experienced complications during delivery, and they had worked together through the night to save both mother and calf. The successful birth had left them exhausted but exhilarated, sitting together on the barn floor as dawn broke over the Montana landscape. In that moment of shared triumph and vulnerability, the careful barriers they had maintained between their working partnership and their growing feelings finally dissolved. The kiss that followed felt as natural and inevitable as sunrise, and when Sarah whispered that she loved him, Marcus found that the words he had thought he would never say again came easily in response. Their wedding took place on a perfect September morning, exactly 1 year after Sarah had collapsed on Marcus's porch in her ruined wedding dress. The ceremony was small and simple, conducted by a justice of the peace with Sheriff Bradley and his wife as witnesses. Sarah wore a simple blue dress she had ordered online, and Marcus had bought his first new suit in over a decade. As they exchanged vows on the same porch where Marcus had spent 10 years in solitude, both of them understood that they were not just promising to love each other, but committing to the life they had built together. The isolated ranch that had once represented Marcus's retreat from the world had become the foundation for a partnership that was stronger and more fulfilling than either of them had thought possible. The woman who had arrived as a desperate runaway bride had become Marcus's partner in every sense of the word, and the man who had spent a decade avoiding human connection had discovered that the right person could enhance rather than threaten the peace he had found in the Montana wilderness. Together they had created something new and beautiful from the broken pieces of their separate pasts, proving that sometimes the most unexpected encounters can lead to the most extraordinary transformations.